Could you just tell us a little bit about your background and your practice? Um,
So I am, a fifth generation South Asian Kenyan. My family is of the diaspora of Goan heritage, and we were born and raised in Kenya. And so my earlier work looks at the kind of colonial trajectories of and traces and traumas and narratives that brought us from India to Africa, to Kenya specifically. And within that practice, I look at notions of hybridity, spaces of inclusivity, ideas of how do we find social solidarity within communities to kind of break down binaries and barriers so we don't have fracture. Within that, I look at it through, I've done work looking at artifacts, the ideas of questions of authenticity, questions of where is home, because now I live in the United States, but my family immigrated from Kenya to Canada. So the idea of like how identity is constantly in a space of flux and space of transition, and within that, I really think about the diaspora. Like I am South Asian, I am Indian Goan, I am Kenyan, I am Canadian, and by nature I'm also American because I live in these spaces. I think about lived experience as a space of informing identity, that we're not one thing, that we're constantly in a moment of flux and movement. And that's why within the Rhizome exhibition, I was thinking about that as a concept of constantly being in process, and this idea of becoming something else all the time. I'm not one thing, I'm one thing today, but I'll be something else tomorrow, or within this moment, I'll be something else like in that next moment. And so I really play with that in my work. I think also a lot about activism and spaces of politics through, this idea of imagined possibilities of futures, anti-capitalism as a space of how do we dismantle hegemonies, how do we dismantle power dynamics. I also now do this a lot through the space and voice of movement. So it's interesting to say that movement has a voice, but I think that dance is political. My background comes from a dance background as well, ballet and modern dance training. And within that, I try to use dance as a means to support the body, challenge the body, burden the body, labor the body, and question those spaces within, the kind of contrast to how we think about labor within a capitalist society. How do we think about activism as in a capitalist society, or even the notions of how those things are framed as being bad or good, and so again binary, so kind of dismantling. So a lot of my earlier work looked at cultural identity through the histories of my family's trajectory, looking at artifacts, and then I've been looking at a lot about these ideas of dismantling power through dance, but also finding spaces of solidarity, safe spaces, brave spaces, and how do we then implement that to a greater community. And so always fostering collaboration, generosity, kindness in the space of collectivity.
if you could talk a little bit about what your process is in sort of doing this, talking or responding to political history through sort of essentially an abstract form, which is dance, or a universal form of that kind.
One thing that I'll say is, like, I work in many different aspects of dance, like meaning like maybe like specifically like a technique like ballet or modern dance, but like when I work with different dancers, they may be I just did a project in Greece, for example, and many of the dancers didn't speak English, but we understood each other through our body language. So dance itself becomes a language that we understand, and it is particular to dancers. Like I look for certain things and I know how the body should look in this certain kind of position, but within our group, we know how to read the body. So I find that's a really beautiful space of inclusivity. We might come from different cultures, we might speak different languages, we might have never met each other, but we can communicate through our body language. And that's something that's really important. And that's something that's been a big challenge during the pandemic, because, we can't be together, because there's that sense of intimacy as well, a sense of being collective, right? We have to be together. We support each other in those actions. And so that's something that is being stressful and lacking, and hopefully coming back. And I just did my first live piece in Greece, but it was a solo. And so I did it on purpose because it was kind of meant to be, it was hard to make that dance because I'm reliant on many bodies together. And in this piece, it felt very strange because it was just like one person moving, and I was like, I need more, because I was just used to that. But that was just kind of the concept, like it had to be one dancer doing the piece by themselves, because again, in terms of like the parameters that we now have to live under. But in terms of like process, I think through experience, through things that my body has lived through the traumas that my body has experienced, and within that, I kind of start to kind of think about. I kind of think my work is very process-based. It germinates and takes time to make an idea happen, or to fully know what this idea is going to be. And even sometimes when I make something, it still has resonance. It still starts to kind of inform me, and then it moves on to the next phase of practice. And I think also within my work, I'm thinking through not only necessarily like things that are negative, like traumas or violence against the body. Those things definitely do come into play. But I also think about, newness, new forms. How do we make new things? And I think the pandemic has been something that's really pushed me forward to think about, how do I make dance? I'm telling you, we can't be together. We can't touch each other. So how do I make this? So I think that resilience is something political that I also try to push in my work. How do we find resistance? How do we stay resilient? And making new forms, new ways of doing things is also part of it. So, I made a piece, it's called The Left Space, but then the pandemic happened and we didn't know what to do. And then we kept on postponing. And then it was like, let's make a video piece. And I was like, I don't want to make a video piece. So I'm like, I work and live on this platform called Zoom every day. Let's make a dance on Zoom. I never imagined making a dance on Zoom. And we used the kind of platform, the grid system, the kind of structural system of the platform. And we had dancers by themselves dancing in their spaces on rolling chairs, and they had a whole choreography. And we made this kind of thing that looked so different from what, like, when I look at it on the screen, it's different from what the dancers are doing in their space. Because we would play with filters, and I can show you, for example, we had all these different filters that we would play with to kind of create a virtual space. And then we kind of play with this idea of being invisible and invisible. And we would kind of play with the cameras and like do these kind of things. So it ended up feeling like we were in the nightclub or something, or we were creating this kind of like space. But it also felt collective, right? All 8 dancers were together with the same background, made them feel they were in the same space. And so it felt like everyone was together. And there's a moment where we all were trying to like touch each other and move to each other. And it became this kind of like beautiful kind of like gestural space of trying to like touch, trying to find intimacy in the space. And so, again, the reason I brought that up or mentioned that is because, circumstances, my conditions, also inform how I make things. Last summer, Black Lives Matters protests were happening throughout the city. It was affecting my body, it was affecting my sleep, it was affecting my psyche. It was making me question my own sense of self in this world, and that communicates a space that I then respond to. Because as an artist, I have a responsibility to make and inform and hopefully, create dialogue.
The imposed distance that we have now, but also how do you try to transcend it, and how, for instance, the exhibition Diasporic Rhizome, how it's trying to create a parallel map, is this idea of like alternative geography, like through Zoom, through the sense of virtual space.
Or even that the idea that an artist, and again, the form of exhibiting is to show in a museum or to show in a gallery or to put work up in a space. In this moment, I don't know if the main form of exhibiting is going to be a museum or a gallery. We've seen these, again, finding new ways of exhibiting, new forms, which also challenge people. Like my grad students were very upset at the end of their 2 years because they were like, we worked towards an exhibition. And we said, well, and they're like, because they wanted that form. They wanted that idea of like a white cube with their work inside that white cube. And I was saying to them, like, let's find a way to make this still valid, important, and disseminate it, where it still kind of creates this, but it won't be this, because now we can't do this. And, for dance, it was even harder because, you could put up work in a white space and then send one person at a time to see it, to make it quote unquote safe. But with dance, we have the formalities, the etiquettes of the theater. You come into a space, you walk into a space, you sit in a space, you have many bodies together. How do we do that? And that was a deeper challenge. And my work is never on a stage or in a theater, but it still involves the multiplicity of bodies coming together and touching to be with each other. And that was a huge kind of question. But I think that, the deeper things that in these moments, how do we find an alternative? Like it might not be an exhibition. It might not be a dance on stage. It might not be, I thought to myself, maybe I will never make art again. But of course, that's just was me in the first moments of being dramatic, but it found its way in different ways. And so I think a lot about my work also through Marxism and the ideas of a Marxist imaginary, the idea that we are living in this space and we need to find change and we definitely need to make it happen. But if I just kind of like falter and let myself live in this space and just say nothing was going to happen, then I'll be stuck here. So I think about it through the idea of imaginary, an imagined space, an imagined future. Like how do I find, if I'm in a circumstance that I'm not wanting to be in, how do I then find an alternative to make it function, to even just imagine the step forward? And I always use the word moving forward, because I like that dance language. To move forward is to also think about a future.